Hey, I'm sure you're so happy that we're approaching the end. So Chapter 17, Inflation, Unemployment, and Federal Reserve Policy, and the end of this section is actually Chapter 19, which is about international implications of economic policy. But I thought that was too long to put on the opening slide. No? Okay. The black and white guy up there is a guy named A.W. Phillips. He's from, well, he's dead now, but he was from New Zealand. And he did some analysis and produced something that is called the Phillips Curve. So A.W. Phillips, New Zealand. The Phillips Curve was not created as a theoretical exercise. It was created as a data exercise where he went out and he made observations of data in the real world over a period of time and came to a conclusion about what that data showed and put those data up on articles and published them so that other people could see what his data said. All right? And what the data said is that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay? So originally we get this graph from Phillips that says, look, when unemployment is high, inflation is low. When inflation is high, unemployment is low. So not suggesting cause and effect, not suggesting anything other than this relationship seems to exist, and we need to now go figure out the theoretical basis behind it. Why does this exist? Okay, why? Down at the bottom here is Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman is part of his theoretical analysis, says, you know, if the Phillips curve exists, it can only exist in the short run. And essentially, the Phillips curve is all about aggregate demand changing and aggregate supply not changing. Okay? And aggregate supply having a slope. So a Phillips curve looks like this. All right? And we'll get back to that aggregate demand and supply stuff in a second. A Phillips curve looks like this. So you have the inflation rate up one side, you have the unemployment rate out the other side. And this is not the way he initially drew it, but it's the way that we draw it to make life easier for y'all when you take principles. And of course, our job is to make life easier for you when you take principles, but this is kind of what it says. So it says, look, if we're at 7% unemployment and the inflation rate's holding on 3%. If we want to lower unemployment to 4%, we've got to accept a higher inflation rate of 5%. And economists basically worked on the assumption for decades that this is the way the world in fact worked. And you were going to get more of one if you got less of the other. And if we look at the late 1970s, early 1980s, we had really high inflation in the United States. The thing we did to get rid of that inflation drove up unemployment. So we went from having double-digit inflation to having, 4% inflation. And we went from having 4% unemployment to having 10% unemployment. So we seem to have traded those off. Now, modern economists argue that that was unnecessary, that there are ways to change the inflation rate without changing unemployment, and we'll talk here in a second. Okay, so you remember this graph, hopefully. So let's use monetary or fiscal policy, it doesn't matter, to shift the AD curve to the right. So we're going to increase aggregate demand. We're going to shove aggregate demand out. We're going to increase the money supply, lower interest rates, spend more money, cut taxes, something like that, and we're going to shift AD out. When we shift AD out, what happens to real GDP? Well, real GDP increases. That means we're producing more stuff. That means there are more jobs. That means there should be less unemployment. So we push that out to get less unemployment. Unemployment falls. But what else happens on this curve? Well, we got a new price, right? And I didn't really draw a line there, but here's our new equilibrium. Prices are up here. So prices rose. We have inflation. We got rid of the unemployment, but we created inflation. And that's just this basic aggregate demand, aggregate supply with a short run aggregate supply curve that slopes upward. Now, if AS is moving, if the SRAS is moving around, this doesn't work. If it's the LRAS, not the SRAS, this doesn't work. Okay? So there's, like every economic theory, there's assumptions behind this, and if the assumptions are right, then the theory is probably going to be okay. If there's problems with the assumptions, then we have a theory problem. And again, I don't want to say bad things about economists, but we have a tendency to tell you the theory and not give you the assumptions. Whenever somebody says to you, well, this will just figure out what the assumptions are that are behind that comment, and only believe, don't say I believe that theory or don't believe that theory. Ask yourself whether you believe the assumptions behind it or not. If you believe the assumptions, then you should be okay with the theory. If you don't believe the assumptions, then you need to question what that person's saying. But 98% of the people in the world begin their theory discussions by spouting theory, and they don't lay out the assumptions they're making before they make the theory. And that's actually the most important part. Okay? So this Phillips curve works if SRAS is stable, if it doesn't move, if it's upward sloping, right? There's assumptions in here. All right. But what happens in the long run? Well, in the long run, you have this vertical LRAS. If we increase aggregate demand, we get inflation, but we don't get any more jobs than we had before. So that says to us, hey, this Phillips curve, if it exists, is a short-run phenomenon. Okay? I have some video here for you to watch in a second, and you'll be very excited by that video. So this would give us no change in unemployment, but a change in inflation. What we'd really like to see is the opposite of that. What we'd really like to see in the world is unemployment change, but no inflation. We'd like to see unemployment come down like it has for the last 8 years. Unemployment's gone down every year for the last 8 years. We haven't had inflation. That's what we want. How does that happen in this? Well, that happens if aggregate supply is kind of flat, right? Not bumpy up like that, or straight up and down like that. The only way we'd get jobs without inflation is for aggregate supply actually to be flat, and that's not in any of these pictures. Just saying. Okay, so behind this is Milton Friedman, who came up with this idea of a natural rate of unemployment, which economists today often refer to as the Nehru, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which you like. It's much easier just to say natural rate of unemployment. At potential GDP, on the LRAS, there will still be unemployment. There will be frictional and structural unemployment. There will still be people changing jobs. There will still be people who, for whatever reason, are just not able to work, can't find a job. So there's this natural rate of unemployment. There's an amount of unemployment which is just kind of equilibrium unemployment for the economy. All right? And remember that Milton Friedman dragged this word natural out of Adam Smith's playbook to connect himself back to Adam Smith and the classical economists and talk about natural, which Adam Smith that was his way of saying equilibrium, was to say natural. So there's more to it than that. There's a philosophical thing behind it too. But this natural rate of unemployment, that if we leave things alone, that's where we'll get. So the best unemployment rate that we can possibly get is the rate that happens if we leave the economy alone, if we laissez-faire the world and we don't get involved in it. That's how you get, in Adam Smith's world and in Milton Friedman's world, that's how you get the best possible unemployment rate. Okay? Okay.
And I've been seeing lately that economists are increasingly worried that the idea of a Phillips curve that links unemployment and inflation is no longer describing what is happening in today's economy. Have you been considering on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very much so. We spend a great deal of time on that. The connection between slack in the economy, or the level of unemployment, and inflation was very strong if you go back 50 years, and it's gotten weaker and weaker and weaker to the point where it's a faint heartbeat that you can hear now. It's still there. You can see it at state-level data and things like that. But I think we really have learned, though, that the economy can sustain much lower unemployment than we thought without troubling levels of inflation. Mm-hmm. And I think I would look at today's level of unemployment as well within the range of potential estimates, of plausible estimates of what the natural rate of unemployment is.
So do we get that? That's AOC, who was an econ major in college, though. She once referred to Milton Keynes in a speech he was giving, and I don't think either Friedman or Keynes would like being squished in with the other one. But basically, Jay Powell here is saying, look, we're at the natural rate of unemployment. We got to the natural rate of unemployment without there being inflation. So there isn't a lot of current in the modern markets. Phillips curve doesn't seem to hold. He says it's a faint heartbeat. So we went from a period where there seemed to have been a Phillips curve to a period where there doesn't seem to be a Phillips curve. We got that? So despite the fact that your book takes almost a whole chapter to talk about the Phillips curve, there's no evidence that it exists in the modern world. Over the last 20 years or so, there's a faint heartbeat. Okay, well, some of this is tied into all these theories. Here's our guy, Lucas. If we remember, this is Robert Lucas over there. He came up with, and other people too, but because nothing is ever, there's somebody's law in mathematics. I forget who it is because I'm not a mathematician. I'm an economist. And I do math, but I'm not a mathematician. Anyway, in math, there's somebody's law that says things are never named after the person who actually invented them, right? That inventing theories is something that, multiple people always come up with every theory. There isn't a theory that just one person came up with, but the theories always end up named after one person, and it's never the person who actually is most responsible for it. Right? But anyway, so we got Lucas, there's other people, we get this rational expectations revolution in economics. Remember that expectations is what we think will happen in the future. So I have an expectation of what the fall semester is going to be like. I'm thinking what the future is going to be like. I had an expectation of what spring 2020 was going to be like, and I was wrong. Okay, not as wrong as some people, because I actually told my class pretty early on that something was going to happen because of the virus. But I didn't think what was going to happen happened. I thought actually we were going to cancel school. But anyway, I have this view of the future. I have this view of what fall of 2020 is going to be like. I have a view of what 2022 is going to be like. I might be wrong, but I have expectations of the future. I have economic expectations for the whole economy. I have economic expectations for what's happening in Las Vegas, and I have personal expectations about things that are going on in my life, okay? So all of us have these expectations of the future. The question is, how do we create them? All right? How do we come up with these expectations? So there's a variety of theories of how we come up with them. One is called adaptive expectations. And adaptive expectations basically says you take where you are and you take what happened and you adapt your expectations, right? So you don't just jump somewhere. You say, okay, so I thought we were going to be at 5. We're actually at 10. So maybe next I think we're going to be at 7 or 8, right? I don't jump from 5 to 10. Maybe I jump part way up there because I don't really believe the 10 is where we're going to stay. Okay? I adapt. What Lucas and his friends came up with is something called rational expectations. And rational expectation says people use all available information, including information about how the economy works, to make up their expectations of the future. What that means is that people understand how things work. They actually do understand how things work. If their real wage is falling, they understand that their real wage is falling, and they understand the implications of that. And they understand that there are natural forces in the world, according to this theory, that there are natural forces in the world that are going to fix that. Okay? And people's expectations of the future may not be exactly right, but they mirror where the economy actually ends up. There's no big disconnect between people's expectations of the future and the way the future turns out. It doesn't mean that everybody's exactly correct, but there's no big disconnect between expectations of the future and reality of the future. Okay? People know things, right? People know things. Now, Keynes, if Keynes were hearing this, he'd be having a heart attack, right? Because Keynes's view of expectations is exactly the other extreme. Keynes says people have no clue what's going on, and they follow the crowd, and they listen to their animal spirits, and there's no systematic way that a normal person sets expectations. And that's why he's able to go into the stock market and anticipate what all those fools are going to do and make money off them. Okay? Because they don't have rational expectations. So Keynes would be just the opposite of this, the rational expectations guy. And why? Let me be clear here too. There's multiple versions of rational expectations. There's easy versions, and then there's very strict versions. So I'm kind of talking mostly about the very strict version, not the more easier versions. But the need for this, if expectations are the way Keynes says, we can't do math. We just can't, right? We're done. Macroeconomics is not about math. You can't do math about macroeconomics. If expectations are adaptive, then the economy is going to adjust slowly to anything that happens. That means the real and the nominal are connected to each other. That means we don't have to worry about the LRAS. That means that classical economics is not the answer, probably, to macroeconomics at least. Okay? If rational economics is correct, then we can have an LRAS, we can discuss, we can debate how long it takes us to get from the SRAS to the LRAS. We can have people who say it's instantaneous and we're on the LRAS all the time. Right? We can have all of these different ideas, and rational expectations is what opens the door, right? In the end, to have this synthesis of ideas, rational expectations is the way that we get there. But again, there's different versions of it, and some are less severe.